Okay, in this video I want to review some of the things that have been covered in this chapter, the chapter on mind. And so I'm assuming that you've read the second half of the chapter, so you're familiar with functionalism. But I want to begin by backing up to the beginning and recalling a few things about dualism. So here on page 6, Appiah describes dualism and Descartes. So Descartes is a dualist. This means that he believes that a mind and a body are two quite distinct sorts of things, two kinds of what he calls substance. And one thing to be clear about with respect to dualism is that, and Appiah doesn't really emphasize this, but this is really for most people the intuitive idea that they have about the mind. I mean, you can call it the spirit if you want, but this thing that you identify as you has your memories, your beliefs, your thoughts, your emotions, your personality traits, and whatever else. And so, one question you might ask to figure out if you are a dualist or not is whether you think that after you die, after your body dies, whether some part of you, spirit, mind, whatever you want to call it, is going to continue to exist. Something that's going to respond to your name, have your memories, still be you. Is something going to exist? If you think that something will exist after your body, after your brain is dead, then you're a dualist. And most of us, at least before we study philosophy of mind, are dualists. That seems to be, for most people, the kind of the starting point. Okay, so this next paragraph here. Since you are your mind, and minds are totally independent of bodies, you could still exist even without a body. Okay, so of course that's what many of us think does happen after we die, and so that's the core idea for dualism, that the mind is this thing that's separate from the body. Okay, but the problem is, I don't want to actually talk about that too much, but I just want to point out that we start with dualism, but there are some pretty significant problems for dualism, and Appiah goes over them. Starting on page 8, for anyone who thinks of mind and body as for anyone who thinks of mind and body as totally distinct needs to offer an answer to two main questions. First, how do mental events cause physical events? And second, how do physical events cause mental ones? And there's actually something here that Appiah doesn't talk about too much. So recall that the mind, being that it's not a physical thing, it's separate from our bodies, Appiah has explained that it's immaterial, it's non-physical. I don't know if he uses those terms exactly, but he does emphasize that it doesn't take up space, doesn't exist in space, has no mass, the mind has no mass, has no texture, has no physical qualities. And so that's going to naturally lead us to wonder, how can something that doesn't exist in space, doesn't have any, it doesn't really have anything of a physical nature, how can that interact with something that's physical? To contrast, it's easy to explain how my hand can pick up a glass. My hand is a physical thing, just needs to grasp onto the glass with enough force, and I can lift up the glass, which is also a physical thing. But if my hand were a non-physical thing, if my hand didn't exist in space, if it was a ghost hand or something, then we would imagine that when it tried to pick up the glass, it would just kind of pass through. It wouldn't be able to get a grip on the glass. So the same problem, or a problem similar to that, arises for dualism. How can something that's mental things, beliefs, desires, thoughts, if they don't exist in space, how can they interact with our brain? Okay, and of course they need to in order to do stuff with our body, interact with our body. Okay, so that's a problem for dualism. I mean, that's what I've just explained there is kind of getting at what Appiah is talking about there, although Appiah doesn't really elaborate on that. In this next paragraph, he explains that Descartes answers the human brain, he thought, was a point of interaction between mind and matter. Okay, so that's actually not quite answering these questions. These questions were, how do these things happen? And Descartes answering where they happen. Not the same thing, but That's basically the answer we get from Descartes. But then, importantly, and this I'll let you go through yourself, or you've already read it, the problem, or the way that Appiah does explain the core problem for dualism is with what he has here on the bottom of page 8 and the top of page 9, culminating with this causal account of location. So the way Appiah explains it is a little bit different than what I was just saying up here about a non-physical mind interacting with a physical body, but it's a related criticism. So that's, here Appiah is basically explaining the core problem for dualism. But that's not everything. So there's also here on page 11, right after Appiah has introduced behaviorism, there's another problem for Descartes' view, which is the trouble with Descartes' view of the mind is that it makes it very hard to see how we can know about other minds at all. So recall the problem of other minds, which is, I want to say the bottom of page 7. But okay, so here Appiah is explaining that dualism can't solve this problem, but behaviorism can solve the problem of other minds, just by the way it defines what it is to be a mind. Okay, so that's another problem for dualism. And then here on page 16, I mean, I've skipped a lot of stuff, but yet another problem for dualism, which is illustrated by Wittgenstein's private language argument. Okay, I'm not going to go into all that, but again, these problems for dualism are really adding up, and they're not minor problems. They're pretty significant problems. They're problems that are showing us that dualism, although it initially seems like a very plausible view, doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Okay, in this paragraph on page 18 then, still in section 1.3, Appiah is explaining that behaviorism can solve the problems that is the problems for the philosophy of mind that are on the bottom of page 7, the problem of other minds and the mind-body problem. Behaviorism can solve both of those problems. Excuse me. So that's, okay, so we've set aside dualism. Now Appiah is focusing on behaviorism. Maybe that's our best theory of the mind. And I should say, for behaviorism, this is the same theory that you study in Intro to Psychology, behaviorism. I mean, you focus on different things, perhaps, in your Intro to Psych class, but we're talking about the same theory. So you're familiar with it. Okay, so, but only briefly, is behaviorism our leading theory in this chapter, because right after that, at the end of section 1.3, Appiah discusses some problems for behaviorism, and the idea is the problems we get in these two paragraphs on 18 and 19 are significant problems. I'll let you look at them, but the conclusion is going to be that neither behaviorism nor dualism seem to be satisfactory theories. Okay, so that brings us then up to functionalism, and so the idea for functionalism, or the idea when we get to this point, is that we've looked at the two other best theories of the mind, the two other theories that have tried to historically explain what the mind is, and both of them have failed. And so what Appiah is basically saying in the second half of the chapter is that functionalism is our best theory, our leading theory. And this also, for people who have studied psychology, functionalism is basically the foundation for cognitive psychology today. Unless you've really studied a lot of psychology, you might not come across the word functionalism, but basically what psychologists are doing, and here I mean cognitive psychology, not necessarily social psychology or all the other varieties of psychology, clinical or whatever, but cognitive psychology is basically built on this theory of functionalism. Okay, and so anyway, the theory in a nutshell is this idea that the mind is like a computer program. Okay, skipping ahead to 22, of our two issues from section 1.2, from page 7, what justifies our belief that other minds exist at all, and how are we to explain the relationship of a mind and its body? Okay, and so both of these issues, functionalism can explain or can solve. So that's good for functionalism. And again, it is a good theory. It is what, for the most part, our best theory. However, looking on page 28, there is a problem for functionalism. And although I've said that functionalism is a good theory and maybe our best theory, the problem for functionalism is pretty significant. And it has to do with conscious experience, something that we started thinking about at the very beginning of the chapter. So Appiah says at the bottom of this page, the bottom of page 28, it isn't enough to have internal states that lead you to respond in the right way. You must also have an inner life. That inner life has to have the sort of character that Descartes thought it had. It has to be a conscious mental life. It has to be conscious mental life. Okay, and so the problem then is it's hard to see how we get conscious experience, that is a conscious mental life, if we understand the mind as a computer program. If that's the way we're thinking about a mind, it's not easy to see how we can explain these experiences that seem to be very central to having a mind. Okay, so that was just a quick review to make sure you're clear on kind of the most important themes that run through this chapter. We're looking at different ways of explaining the mind. We start with dualism. We move on to behaviorism kind of quickly, but it's still an important one. And then Appiah gets on to functionalism. And the idea is that each theory is able to solve problems that the prior ones can't. Although even as we see, functionalism still runs into some problems. But what are you going to do? The mind is tough.